In another life, it might have set the world on fire, thundering across continents at astonishing speeds, taking the dream of supersonic commercial flight and ushering it into reality. The Boeing 2707 could very well have become the way of the future, better than the Concorde in a whole wide range of ways. In the brainchild of a company that's since become a global leader in commercial aviation, the 2707 was a beautiful machine that had just about everything going for it. And when it was condemned to death in the Boeing boardroom, wiped off the drawing board with not even a chance to prove itself, the world lost that beautiful machine and everything that might have come with it. It's no secret we're a bit salty on this one, and on today's episode of Megaprojects, we're going to endeavor to explain why you should also be pretty salty about it too. So join us for this exploration of the beast that was the Boeing 2707, why the world wanted it, what it might have become, and why the powers that be saw fit to erase it from history. Unless you've got experience as either a military pilot or a garage engineer with an interest in strapping yourself to rockets, we're looking at you, Peter, then we'd be willing to bet that you've never experienced supersonic flight. That's perfectly understandable. We haven't either, and neither have most people on the planet. But ask somebody at the turn of the 1960s whether the people of Earth in 2024 would have made supersonic flight a part of everyday life, and the answer almost certainly would have been yes. Ever since American test pilot and general-purpose badass Chuck Yeager pushed the Bell X-1 past the sound barrier for the first time, the mid-20th century had become a frenzy to develop better and, most importantly, faster aircraft, not just for military purposes, but for civilian purposes too. The goal of creating a mass-produced supersonic transport, or SST plane, was seen as a key priority from the United States to Europe to the Soviet Union. Not only would such a plane have very real military applications, in keeping with the broader arms race of the Cold War, but it would also be a major PR victory for whichever nation achieved the feat first. After all, it wasn't the sort of grand national achievement that an ordinary person could only see on television, like a moon landing or a military victory abroad. Instead, a truly successful SST would be the sort of accomplishment that the little old lady in Iowa, so to speak, could personally buy a ticket to ride. In the United States, the Boeing company had first begun exploring the idea of an SST project all the way back in 1952, just 5 years after humans had intentionally flown through the sound barrier for the first time. At that time, the requisite technology for a supersonic commercial airliner was nowhere near where it would need to be, and Boeing knew that full well, but they continued investment and research anyway. By 1960, the company had a full, permanent research committee devoted to the idea with $1 million in annual backing. That's roughly equivalent to $10.5 million today. So when newly inaugurated President John F. Kennedy did what he did best and demanded to know how American industry, the airline industry in this case, planned to set and reach its aviation goals in the coming decade, well, Boeing was perfectly placed to capitalize on the government's findings. By mid-1961, the Kennedy administration's FAA, or Federal Aviation Administration, had its answer. According to Director Najib Halaby, investment into an SST was going to be of paramount importance, to the point, by their logic, failure to do so would constitute a lasting setback to American ambitions. This was not a unanimous assessment within the US government, by any means. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, one of the most important Kennedy administration officials of all, would contend that the SST was a waste of time and money, and that Halaby's projections were unreliable at best. But unbeknownst to Kennedy and his inner circle, they were still in the easy phase of the SST debate. The portion of this emerging technological race when the Americans still didn't think they had anybody to race against. When in 1962 the US realized that Britain and France were about to merge their own nascent SST projects into a real and very well-funded initiative, the Kennedy administration changed its tune, and fast. According to Halaby, who was still pushing the SST concept, the US would risk losing 50,000 jobs and $4 billion in income if they continued to drag their feet. So when the Kennedy administration sent out requests for SST proposals to Lockheed, North American Aviation, and Boeing, the latter organization was poised to get working immediately. Boeing had already worked out a few key components to its design. It would probably include a swing wing design that allowed it to adjust to supersonic flight. It would probably be made with a priority on transatlantic flights, and it would probably have a minimum carrying capacity of at least 150 passengers. By the time it submitted a preliminary design in January 1964, those parameters had evolved. Boeing's four-engine design would indeed use a swing wing, plus high-lift devices on the wing edges, and an option to stretch the fuselage and add another 77 passengers. Now, it's important to understand here that even in the early days, the budding SST industry was swimming against the tide. Cost projections suggested that a supersonic airliner built and operated so soon would be stupid expensive and face questionable, if not minimal, returns. The technology for such an aircraft wasn't really all there either, and it wouldn't be for a while. The Europeans had a massive head start, and the Soviets were ahead of the Americans too, meaning that the American public was more likely to get a consolation prize than the first-place trophy. And finally, the SST program still had plenty of opponents in the Kennedy administration, in Congress, and all across the American public. But even still, the US government funneled some serious money into the project, which became an even more urgent priority when the US's own unofficial flag carrier, Pan Am, said that it would consider European-made SSTs if American ones weren't available. In terms of the competition, Boeing was clearly the company that had come with the clearest vision for a purpose-built SST. The Lockheed entry appeared to ask the philosophical question, what if we looked at the Concorde, copied it, and made it bigger? The North American aviation entry asked a philosophical question of its own. What if we took our design for the XB-70 Valkyrie bomber, added some windows, and put people where the bombs were supposed to go? And now, to be fair, the Boeing design has more than a little bit of military overlap as well. The early proposals they suggested would have been a dead ringer for their eventual B-1 Lancer bomber, which took its first flight just over a decade later. But it was still a new design using new ideas, and one that seemed far better suited to the task of building an all-American SST rather than a knockoff or a repurposed bomber. Boeing and Lockheed were asked to develop their proposals further, while North American aviation was patted on the head and told better luck next time. And when the more detailed second-round proposals came back for presentation in 1966, Boeing made the FAA's choice seem like no choice at all. When it earns the American government's sign-off on January 1, 1967, the Boeing design, then called the Model 733-390, was a clear advancement on anything that global aviation could offer at the time. Leaving behind the ease of production that the Lockheed competitor had offered, Boeing had gone in a different direction, a high-performance aircraft that had the potential to redefine air travel itself. We should emphasize here that the plane underwent a few tweaks during the latter development process, a timeline that we're not going to recap day by day in this video. Instead, we'll focus on what the eventual Boeing 2707 was meant to be, and what a beast that it would have been. Powered by 4 General Electric GE4J5P afterburning turbojet engines, each producing a full 63,000 pound force of thrust, the 2707 would have hit a maximum speed of Mach 2.7. That's 2,071 miles per hour, or 3,300 kilometers an hour. More importantly, that's over 700 miles per hour, over 1,000 kilometers an hour, faster than the Concorde. Projected to have a carrying capacity of roughly 292 passengers, the 2707 would have featured a wide-body fuselage with 7 seats and 2 aisles in a 2-3-2 configuration that would have been a major improvement on the airliners of the day. It would also have been well more than double the Concorde's highest density layout, and yes, we'll be bagging on the Concorde for the rest of today's video, so buckle up for that. With an expected range of 4,000 miles, 6,400 kilometers, the 2707 would have been more than capable of transatlantic flights, as well as modern-day flights from Miami to Brasilia, Honolulu to Tokyo, and transcontinental from Los Angeles to Boston, a distance it would have been able to cover in an hour and a half at worst. That's just a bit less than the Concorde could have done, but would have more than enabled quicker and more capacity-efficient flights on the route the Concorde was actually assigned to. And the advantages of the 2707 went a lot further than that. Since it used high-lift devices on the leading and trailing edges of the wings, it would have been far quieter than Concorde and the Soviet Tu-144, and was much more efficient in its climb. Its swing-wing design would have allowed it to fly at subsonic altitudes if need be, without losing out on efficiency, and at least initially, the plane was expected to operate at a lower cost than the Concorde too. Sure, supersonic flight would use more fuel, but in theory, greater utilization of these aircraft would lead to a more efficient industry overall. As more and more details about the plane began to emerge, it quickly morphed into a promising business endeavor. By October of 1969, a combined 26 US and foreign airlines had reserved spots for eventual aircraft delivery, including 15 for Pan Am and 12 for Trans World Airlines, plus orders from United, American, and Delta. Boeing believed the production line aircraft assembly could begin as soon as 1969, with a prototype taking flight in 1970 and FAA certification by 1975 at the latest. But, alas, the initial optimism around the Boeing 2707 would, before long, begin to morph into skepticism. The first problems came when the International Air Transport Association released its own design imperatives for all SST projects with the goal of cutting down on fuel costs and carbon emissions and minimizing the impact of potentially damaging sonic booms. Now, these were all good ideas, and they were important, forward-looking issues to tackle, but they wrought havoc on the 2707 design. First, Boeing attempted to add canyards behind the nose of the aircraft. Then they had to abandon the swing-wing design because it was expected to be far heavier in practice than Boeing had initially believed. That meant it would have a dramatically reduced range. The company also planned to flex the fuselage, but that ended up causing issues with the ability to control the aircraft in flight, which is a rather important attribute to preserve for a commercial airliner. By 1968, Boeing had moved on to a fixed delta wing and reduced the plane's overall capacity to 234 passengers, still more than double the average Concorde flight, but less than had been promised. Work began on a mock-up design and 2 prototype craft. Orders from airlines kept pouring in, and public hype grew to the point that SSTs like the Boeing 2707 were widely regarded as the way of the future, but it wasn't meant to be. Public opposition to the project was no longer able to be drowned out by the US government's enthusiastic endorsements. Environmentalists had raised concerns about the potential for supersonic high-altitude flights to destroy the global ozone layer, which, to be fair, humans were already doing more than enough to annihilate. On top of that, the American public was becoming increasingly concerned about so-called bang zones left behind by aircraft that went supersonic. The paperback book SST and Sonic Boom Handbook claimed that every SST flight would send destructive sonic booms along a path 50 miles wide by 2,000 miles long, and when a real-life XV-70 flight produced far less damage than the book had projected, the focus wasn't on the possibility that the effects had been overestimated, but on the fact that sonic booms from aircraft of this size did indeed cause real-life property damage. Add to that statements by presidential advisor Russell Train, who had claimed that a fleet of 500 SSTs operating at 65,000 feet for several years could raise or even double the amount of water in the stratosphere and create what Train called a global gloom. Not a change of mood per se, but a water vapor blanket around the Earth that would stop ozone formation, increase ground level heat, and probably cause a change in mood too, as a bit of a byproduct. And finally, there was the most ironic barrier of all, the one that the Boeing company had inadvertently created by themselves. Its name was the then conceptual Boeing 747 jetliner, and the issue at hand was the possibility for the 747 to offer lower fares, higher carrying capacity, and none of the engineering, cost, or public controversy concerns of the 2707. The 747 had the interesting effect of providing a legitimate exit from the 2707 project for all parties involved. The US government could save a whole lot of money while planning to poke holes in the increasingly beleaguered Concorde when it finally took to the skies, while environmentalists, sonic boom opponents, and other anti-SST advocates were getting what they wanted. The airlines who had planned to operate the 2707 could rework some plans and upgrade their fleets with the 747, while of course Boeing too could change their plans while still anticipating a pretty major profit. It was already well on the way toward repurposing some of its 2707 research into the B-1 Lancer, so even that work wouldn't go to waste. With just about everybody given the opportunity for a graceful exit, Boeing, the airline industry, and anti-SST public and the American government chose to lock arms and head for the hangar door. Behind them, they left a couple of 2707 mock-ups, a couple of half-finished prototypes, and the broken dreams of aviation nerds like ourselves. With all the myriad failures of the Concorde and the Tupolev across the coming decades, it seemed as if all parties involved got proof positive that it was the right decision to bail on the 2707 while they still had the chance. And bail they did. In one last fitting farewell, the city of Seattle emptied itself of tens of thousands of Boeing employees who'd been laid off, so many in fact that 2 real estate agents put up a billboard near the local airport reading, "Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights?" Now, when we consider the decision to cancel the Boeing 2707, we've got to first acknowledge that based on the information and technology available to them at the time, the decision makers at Boeing did what they had to do. In the short term, getting the 2707 into the skies would have required major government and private investment, where returns probably wouldn't have come for a very long time. Moreover, there were no guarantees that sonic booms wouldn't devastate the country, that SSTs wouldn't massacre the ozone layer, or that the 2707 would have fared any better than the Concorde or even the Tupolev, which completed a total of 55 passenger flights in its entire service life before being grounded permanently. We here at Megaprojects may be more than a little bit bitter that the 2707 never went into production. We certainly can't fault the thinking that led to its cancellation. However, it's now 2024. And we do have the benefit of better technology, better scientific analysis, and most of all, hindsight. While we won't use that hindsight to roast Boeing's 1971 board of directors too horribly, we do want to at least take a moment and flesh out what might have changed if the 2707 really did go into production. First, we got to talk about the concerns that directly led to its cancellation, and we'll start with the ozone layer. According to a study carried out in 1995 by America's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and some academic partners, the continued operation of a fleet of 500 commercial SST aircraft would indeed have led to an effect on the ozone layer, but not as big as you'd think. Rather than the ozone-devouring scourge that these planes were imagined to be, a full fleet in continual operation would have led to somewhere between a 1% and 2% drop in global ozone. Certainly not nothing, but not enough to doom an SST project like the more vague environmental fears of the early 1970s actually did. And then there's the matter of a sonic boom. As we mentioned, the sonic booms that early SSTs and supersonic bomber aircraft produced were certainly not nothing, but as the Concorde aircraft proved, the effects of such a boom could be managed by going supersonic while over the ocean, and the effects were nowhere near as destructive as American opponents had initially feared. And then there's the factors that doomed the Concorde specifically, its operating costs. On the one hand, the Concorde may not have been a uniformly profitable aircraft, but it did have plenty of periods in its history when it did end up turning a profit, and overall the 14 commercial aircraft that did see service are today regarded as having produced sufficient returns to justify their operation. The delays and cost overruns of the Concorde project, of course, cannot be applied uniformly to the 2707, and nor can the American Carter administration's restrictions on Concorde operations that had been intended to protect American aircraft manufacturers, which of course Boeing was. Finally, while the very visible Paris crash of a tuple of SST greatly increased fears over utilization of the Concorde, there's no telling whether the introduction of a better aircraft in the 2707 might have eased those fears, or even built a reputation on the new plane's ability to surpass its predecessors. Add to that the implicit advantage that the 2707 would have had by being introduced only after the Tupolev and Concorde SSTs had gotten their rough early phases out of the way, and it's likely that the early design changes could have further enhanced the 2707. Say that the worst did happen. The 2707 was beset by all these same concerns and had its initial order of 115 aircraft drastically diminished. The Concorde ultimately retained 14 of its initial 74 orders. Keeping that same contract retention rate, we'll say about 22 copies of the 2707 would have been produced. And it's here that we get into the other major reason the 2707 might have survived where the Concorde didn't. Its potential to be not a final product, but a first-generation aircraft that would pave the way for later models. As we've seen in the decades since, the Concorde spent a total of 27 years in service, during which time the world saw major advancement in aircraft engineering, engine efficiency, sonic boom reduction, and more. And while a combination of multinational, multi-corporation partnerships and a long series of black eyes around the Concorde program were more than enough to stifle any efforts to produce, say, a Concorde 2, we've seen before and since the years of the Boeing 2707 that the Boeing company is intensely proactive when it comes to evolving their existing line of commercial aircraft. A decently successful handful of Boeing 2707s, which seemed on track to prove that they were all-around better aircraft than the Concorde, might be enough to hold over the company for a decade or so until technology can catch up to ambition. And then that technology begets a somewhat more successful, somewhat more advanced series of Boeing 2717s and then Boeing 2727s and so on. As we've seen in megaprojects from the Apollo program to the Manhattan Project and more, inventions and technological evolutions that would otherwise take decades can be done in the span of years if the right motivation and the right R&D budget is available. And for a company as hungry to produce aircraft as the modern-day Boeing company, we can only imagine what a multi-generational SST project might have looked like. Fortunately though, we might not have to imagine for much longer. Because meet the Boom Overture, brainchild of a company called Boom Technology that's backed by well-known names like OpenAI's Sam Altman. We've not yet done a separate piece on the Overture, so please let us know if you'd like to see that. But here are the basics. Boom Overture is a proposed supersonic jetliner with a top speed of Mach 1.7, with the potential to run several hundred viable routes around the world. The concept uses modern-day technological advancements to enhance what were previously the limitations of 1970s-era supersonic flight. With an anticipated introduction date as soon as 2029, the aircraft has already garnered purchase agreements for 15 copies from United Airlines and 20 from American Airlines, even despite the fact that a first flight is expected to be another 2 years away at minimum. It's with the Overture that American supersonic commercial flight hopes to experience a rebirth, and it's here that we find our final two takeaways about the Boeing 2707. First, the demand for a commercial SST is still there. Despite the failure of the Concorde and the inability of the 2707 to get into the skies at all, modern airlines are willing to spring for contracts before ever having seen the plane fly. And second, the number of advancements still needed to get the Overture into the sky, for example, technology to dependably reduce the impact of sonic booms, well, these are all issues that later generation SSTs evolving from the 2707 probably would have tackled already. As the Overture clearly shows, modernizations and updates to the SST concept are there to be carried out, and innovations are there to be discovered. Had things been just a little bit different all those decades ago, the supersonic jetliners of today might have put the Overture to shame.